All right. Well, today on the show, we're excited to talk to Kelly Flanagan. Kelly, how are you today?
Good. Thank you for having me on, Mark.
Oh, it's a privilege to talk to you. Hey, so you just came out with a brand new book called True Companions,
Yes.
and I would love to hear just a little bit of your story and where the book came from.
Yeah. Well, man, I guess the story starts back in 2012. I'm a clinical psychologist, and in 2012, I thought, I'm going to start doing this blogging thing and tell people what I think about therapy. And that quickly blossomed into a passion for writing that led to my daughter and I showing up on the Today Show in 2014, which was a surreal experience. And that day, the owner of the practice I was at the time happened to be vacationing with his good friend Philip Yancey, and so they watched me on the Today Show, and Philip was gracious enough to connect me with his literary agent, and I wrote my first book, and that first book was actually Lovable, embracing what is truest about you, so you can truly embrace your life. And that book talked about what I consider to be sort of the three essentials of a satisfying life, which is worthiness, belonging, and purpose. And specifically in that order, that we have to embrace our worthiness in order to really show up in the world authentically and find the places we really belong. And then within those circles of belonging, sort of receive and give the encouragement and support to go out and pursue the things that give us a sense of purpose. So I wrote that book and published it in 2017, and then in a way, is a story of me overcoming my own shame and wanting to pass on to my kids like the truths that I've learned about shame and how each of us is worthy exactly the way that we are. But in a way, like that book could only take me so far in my journey and could only take the clients I work with so far in their journey. And so the second book sort of started to emerge. I think of Lovable as a book about how to find belonging, and then True Companions as a book about how to build that belonging into something that can endure through all of life and all the ups and downs of how crazy life can be. um, and so that's what really what this book True Companions is it's a book about how to build belonging into something really enduring. um, One of the roots of it is that I so say 2018 rolls around, and I feel like I've really overcome a lot of my shame. I've published a book now. I've sort of embraced who I am, and I'm feeling a lot less shame in my life, which I would define as the sense that we're not good enough the way we are. And and then all of a sudden I'm like, but my loneliness isn't going away. I thought once I stopped feeling so ashamed, I'd quit feeling so lonely. And I'm connecting with all these amazing people, and I've got these places of belonging, and I still feel lonely. And so actually what I did was I built a book about relationships around this experience of loneliness that we all have. And especially at the very beginning, distinguishing it that loneliness is not the same as shame. Most of us think that it is, that those two things go hand in hand. The only writer I've been able to find who distinguishes the two and speaks of loneliness the way I do is Paul Tillich, the Christian theologian. All my other favorite writers, the Henry Nouwens and Thomas Mertens, everybody always just Jean Vanier, they always combine the two, shame and loneliness. So I wanted to write a book that talks about how loneliness is not a broken part of the human condition, but a natural part of it. And something that doesn't go away completely, even in the closest kinds of relationships, and how you can actually put that loneliness to work for you in relationships. And so that's sort of where True Companions took off from.
Yeah, because in the book you talk quite a bit about loneliness, and yet, like you just now opened up about that, you just changed the way that a lot of people think about loneliness. So I would love for you, if you can you just unpack that a little bit more? Because
Sure.
a lot of times we feel like loneliness, we need to run away from it,
Yep.
and in the book
Hmm.
you actually invite us to lean into it a little bit.
Yeah,
So
lean right into it. Exactly.
yeah.
When I think about lonely, and I think about the way we use words, right? So this word loneliness has a lot of connotation attached to it for a lot of people. And it makes me think of a couple I worked with maybe a decade or even 15 years ago. And they came into a session and one night, and they were fighting tooth and nail about something. And, what are you fighting about? Well, he wants to put a TV in the living room and I don't want to put a TV in the living room, and we can't agree. And so I gave them, I had them start to communicate using some of the tools we've been using in our sessions. And as I was listening closely, something started to dawn on me. And I stopped him and I said to the husband, I said, can you describe in detail the living room? And he started to describe it. And his wife said, that's not the living room, that's the family room. You can put a TV in there. Um, and I think when it comes to loneliness, like when people hear loneliness, they think I'm describing a room that is filled with actually three very painful, broken human experiences. A room inside of us that's filled with abandonment, a room that's filled with shame, and a room that's filled with isolation. And I'm actually describing an entirely different room within us. I'm describing that room right at the center of us, that is entirely us, entirely unique. It's the dwelling place of the divine within us. No one can ever understand it completely because no one else has a room like it, and no one can ever get to it. It's on the inside of us. We're sort of alone within the experience of being who we are, and so I want to talk to people about that space within us, and how if we can move into that space, we get connected to what is most beautiful about us, most worthy, most unique, and we really get to begin to feel comfortable being in our own skin. But because we stay away from that space, or we feel bad about it, we confuse it, think that it means there's something wrong with us, or we feel ashamed of it. We never really get to connect with that part of ourselves right at the center of us. So I'm really excited right now about the reactions I'm hearing from people going, I my loneliness, I don't have to be afraid of it. I don't have to distract from it with, the Netflix or Facebook or chocolate or alcohol. I don't have to blame my partner for it. I don't have to tell them, you're doing something wrong because I'm still feeling lonely. Instead, I can just share my loneliness with them, and they're telling me about their lonely experiences, and now we're more connected. So yeah, I really want to rearrange the way we relate to this experience of loneliness.
Yeah. And so here you are, you're talking about loneliness, and you released this book about true companions right in the
Yeah.
middle of a pandemic,
Yeah.
social distancing,
Right.
and even the idea, the topic of loneliness. I mean, that is at the forefront
Right.
of so many people's minds and their lives. What is it about this moment that even your book? What is it about this moment that you think
Mm,
this is a special moment where we need to really
mm.
consider the idea of true companions?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that the book is arriving at a moment where we're more aware than ever
Mm,
of our need for true companions,
mm,
and our need for true companions in the flesh. There's a chapter in the book that I didn't realize would be quite so prophetic, and I think the title of it is A Cautionary Note About the Digital Crowd.
yeah.
And the idea is that social media and digital connection, it has a place, in our lives for sure, um, but it can't replace analog connection and closeness. And so, ironically, I think I thought I was writing a book to really um, point that out to people, but instead I think the book is releasing into a space where people are really aware of that more than ever. And so the book is just sort of naming what they've experienced over the last year, which is that, yeah, Zoom is never going to replace being in the same room with my closest companions.
Mm,
And so I love that it's speaking to a truth that people are already connecting with. And I think it also helps folks, because I think a lot of us have felt really isolated over the
yeah.
last year, and isolation is different than loneliness. And I
Mm,
think it's helpful to tease those out, that, yeah, you are isolated. You're not in nearly as much connection with people as you have been in the past. And that is something that's not how we're wired. We're wired to be in community and close with people. So yes, we want to get past that, this season of isolation for so many of us. But even once we do, you're still going to feel lonely. Don't expect that to go away. In fact, that's an invitation to get to know yourself better. So I think it's important to distinguish those two in this season as well.
yeah. I think it'd be helpful. Can you unpack what do you mean by true companions? How can we know when we have a true companion?
Yeah. Um, so That's a great question. One at the heart of this book and this idea, and I didn't. This is a surprise to me. I thought. I mean, I wrote Lovable about the unconditional love of God that shows us who we really are, um, created in the image of divine, fearfully and wonderfully made, knitted together in our mother's womb. That sort of unconditional love of God. So I thought I was actually, when I set out to write a book about relationships, I thought I was going to write about unconditional love and relationships. But the more I dug into that, the more I was struck by how the Greeks differentiate between four kinds of love: unconditional love, which they call agape, and then another one is philia, or what we might translate as companionship, actually. Um, and that what I was so struck by was how unconditional love can happen from a long ways away. God can sit up in the heavens, right, and love us unconditionally. But not even God felt like that was enough. God wanted to come down and love us like a companion in the form of Jesus. And so at the beginning of Jesus' life, he shows up in skin to walk through it with us, to walk through the experience of being human. I think that's what true companions do. They say, let's walk through everything together, the whole thing, nothing's off limits. And you see Jesus walking through all the good things, and then you see him calling out the hypocrites, and you see him tipping over tables, and you see him saying to his very best friends, get behind me, Satan. Right? Like he's in it, as a companion. And then at the very end of his time here on earth, one of the last things we know that he says, it's just this beautiful moment. He's sitting with Peter on the beach after his resurrection. They're having breakfast. And he says to Peter 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me, Peter? And the first 2 times in the original text, he uses the word agape. Do you love me unconditionally, Peter? But the last time he asks the question, he says, do you love me? And he uses the word philia. Do you love me as a companion, Peter? So I think God came here to love us as companions with a philia kind of love, and that in the end, he asks us to love him that way as well, and each other with a philia kind of love as true companions who are walking through everything together, who recognize that we are, both of us, very messy, complicated people to be in relationship with, and that we're both really committed. And by both I mean there's at least 2 people in a companionship, but you could say, everyone in this group of companionship is committed to taking personal responsibility for their own growth and the mastering of their own humanity for the sake of the relationship.
Yeah. And so it's this idea that Jesus is modeling this for us.
I think so. Yeah, I think we oftentimes default too quickly to, because I think he is also modeling unconditional love. I think unconditional love is the foundation upon which all relationships are built. But all the building that then goes in, the structure that gets built on top of unconditional love is that philia. And I think he's here doing that building. He's here showing us how to do it, walking alongside us and inviting us to walk alongside him and each other as well.
Yeah. And so if we take that, and here we talk about, on the podcast, we talk a lot about church issues,
Yeah.
and things going on in the church. And so here's Jesus, our model for companionship.
Yeah.
And it just seems like the church struggles with companionship.
Yeah, it does.
Why do you think that is, that in the church we just have a
Yeah.
hard time with, you use that image of, I'm trying to think of exactly how you say it, just
Mhm.
walking through the difficulty, walking through things together.
Yeah.
In the church, that is hard to
Well,
find. Why?
I think the church does something beautiful, which it holds up agape to the world, the
Mhm.
unconditional love of God, and says, this is where we came from, this is where we're returning to. And the church is doing a beautiful thing in ministering to the world in that way. But I think on a day-to-day basis, I think we human beings tend to use unconditional love to sort of take shortcuts around true companionship. So I'll give you, a few examples. So I was on a ministry team at my church. Basically, the church leadership said, we have lay people kind of in sort of therapeutic ministry positions within our church, but they're overwhelmed. So we need professionals. They brought in, several counselors and psychiatrists to sort of serve as a sort of a therapeutic ministry team. Almost every every situation that was brought before us for consultation and discernment involved someone in the church not setting a healthy boundary with someone else in the church because they wanted to love that person unconditionally. And I think that's oftentimes when we start to try to live out unconditional love, there are several ways that we don't do it a service. So we avoid conflict with it, right? We say, well, I know I need to set a boundary on this person, but that's going to get messy and ugly, and I just need to love them unconditionally. So we sort of bow out of that moment, right? We also, I mean, we can tend to love tend to love from a distance, even within a building, right? Oh, I love them unconditionally, but I'm not going to work out any of my stuff with them, right? I'm not gonna try to actually engage in companionship. Whereas Jesus says, go find them, go talk to them, go deal with it, right? Again, philia love. And and I think so I think as a church body, if instead of asking how can we love each other unconditionally, we ask how can I show up to my brothers and sisters as a better companion today, I think it shifts the focus completely and gives us a different perspective for approaching each other, engaging each other, and making our relationships within the church healthier.
Yeah. I've never heard that distinction used for the way we have relationships in the church, agape and philia love, and that whether we realize it or not, a lot of times our tendency is, oh, agape, unconditional love. That's what I
Yes.
try to give you. And so, can you flesh out a little bit more practically what might those boundaries look like? You know, you gave that example, and those people didn't have the boundaries necessary. What might those boundaries be between agape love and philia love in the context of the church?
I'm going to give you a concrete example. This was many years ago. I don't remember the people. So I think it's okay to share this. A church member was using the church van and had been given permission to use it once or twice for their own personal kind of ministry. And had just gotten into the habit of using it every week for that ministry, even though they weren't insured on it, and there was liability issues, and and those sorts of things. And no one within church leadership, they wrestled with, but isn't it loving her unconditionally to let her continue to do that?
Mm.
And the advice of everyone on the board was not, well, actually, probably, yeah, but also loving her like a companion would be sitting her down and saying, there's complications with this, and we'd like to work out a better solution with you. And she might get upset about that. She might feel betrayed by the church. There might be all sorts of complications that go along with that. And sometimes that's why we dodge that work of companionship. But boundaries are co-created, right? Like, and that's the beauty of it, to be able to show up with your voice and say, this is how far I'm willing to go. And for someone else to say, this is how far I'm willing to go, and to try to sort out together the compromise of what relationship is going to look like between the two of you. It's hard work, but it's holy work. And I believe it draws us closer to God in the process.
Yeah. And so besides those boundaries, what do you think are some things that might be in the way of that happening in the church?
Oh, me.
Okay. All right.
Myself. It's always me. So one of the ways I think it's safe to say, wherever there's division, there's protection going on.
Mhm.
And so I think maybe to answer that question fully, I have to give a better accounting of sort of how I see us set up as people, which is, I believe that we come into the world, and that we are created in the image of God with a true self that's given to us. It's created for us. We don't have to do anything to sort of conjure it up. But somewhere along the way in our lives, usually really early on, grade school at the latest, we start to get these messages that who we are isn't good enough, that the way we were created isn't worthy of love and belonging exactly the way it is. And so every young person starts to do the reasonable thing. It's like, oh, well, if I'm not good enough the way I am, if my true self isn't good enough to get love and belonging, then I'm going to build a self that is. And
Mm.
so each of us starts to build this second self early in our lives, which we call the false self, or the ego is a psychological term for it. Spiritually, I think Thomas Merton coined the term false self. Um, and And so we build this false self, and this false self is specifically designed to do two things: to protect us from any more shame, right? To try to prevent us from feeling like we're not good enough, and to try to earn us the love and belonging that we've come to believe our true self can't get us. And so it's so hard because we're wired to want to connect and to be connected with each other, but we've also created this self that is specifically designed to protect us from hurt and from other people. And oftentimes, our relationships are going astray because it's our protective self that's showing up. It's our false self that's showing up. And so you show up to a moment in a relationship and you say, I want to connect with you, but I'm not willing to give up my protections. Right. And so much of like actually the middle third of True Companions is about outlining the 9 core protections that as I see them, that we bring
Mhm.
into relationships. And in true companionship, again, going back to this idea of mutual ownership, you basically say, okay, I'm going to quit trying to tell you what you do wrong in the relationship, and we are both going to focus on observing and becoming aware of our own protections, and then beginning to set them aside and showing up more authentically. And whenever 2 or more people do that, true companionship begins to thrive. But if that protection is unobserved and continues to sort of act as a default mode, it's inevitably going to lead to division or distance.
Yeah. And so how do you begin to deconstruct that false self so that you can begin to act out of the true self? What are some
Yeah,
what are some ways that you can begin to do that?
yeah. Well, so it's a great. I love the word deconstruct. It's so my assumption for years was that, yeah, you deconstruct the false self,
Mhm.
but I think more and more that ends up being a very frustrating losing endeavor.
Mm.
I think that once we create a false self, we've got it, it's with us. And then instead of trying to deconstruct it, we want to simply learn how to sort of exit it and leave it.
Yeah.
And sort of, so one of the metaphors that I use in Lovable is the metaphor of a castle, that
Mhm.
our false self is composed of 3 main components, which is our ego walls, which are the things we do to hide who we really are from the world, our cannons, which are the things we do to sort of more aggressively keep people at bay or keep ourselves safe, and then our thrones, which are the ways that we think we've proven we're good enough, so no one can question us now. And so we've sort of got this false self built around our true self and protecting it as a castle. And we have to choose to lower the drawbridge on that castle so that we can step out into the world and say, here I am. This is my authentic self. Um, and and the reality is that true companionship, it would be great. I think the moment of finding belonging is that moment where you finally step out of the castle and you really show up authentically in the world as your true self. You say, here I am. And a handful of people go, good to see you. Like,
Mm.
I dig you. And these might be people you've known your whole life, right? But good to like, welcome to the game, welcome to life. And now you found belonging. But the reality is, over the course of a relationship, you're going to want to enter and exit that castle countless times, moment to moment, day to day, go back into your protections.
Mm.
And so the work of true companionship is the work of figuring out how to live outside of that castle more consistently and more frequently, so that you're not living from your protections.
Yeah. And so as a church leader, uh, you always hear about how to build environments
Yeah.
where people can build relationships.
Yeah.
But you're saying we can build the environments, but if we don't have the tools for the to realize about we're in this castle and
Mm,
the false self,
mm.
uh, if we don't have the tools, it's going to be really hard to foster those relationships.
Yeah. I mean, I think the tools come down to, yeah, cultivating communities that understand what the
Mhm.
false self is, that don't the tendency whenever you start to become aware of your false self and your protections is to, you sort of see the damage that they've done in your life and the damage they've done in your relationships, and you want to sort of get rid of them. um, but to be able to be, number one, grateful for them, for your false self and for your protections, because you needed them at some point. You built them for a reason. At some point they helped you survive some really tough times, and so you can be grateful for them. But just simply say,
Hey, you're fine. You're fine.
You're good. All right. I don't know if you'll like, I don't know how you do this, if you edit that out or not, but
Oh, leave it in. Leave it
what
in.
that means is that my schnoodle just saw a squirrel, is what that means. And he's at the window just shaking and wanting to get at it. And now my 13-year-old is trying to quiet him down. So the idea is we can be grateful for our false self, and that we need really one of the greatest works of relationship and companionship is the observation of our own
Mm,
protections and false self. And if we can cultivate communities that are doing that and everyone taking responsibility for that, that's going to be amazing. I was just actually on a call for a board that I'm on, and the head of the company said, "Hey, I think I just thought like Kelly Flanagan today, because he's reading True Companions." I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, my wife went exercising this morning, and she came home, and she brought me Starbucks coffee, but I had already made a pot of coffee for her, and I heard in my head, my first reaction was going to be, 'Why'd you buy coffee? I already made you coffee.'" And I realized, like, I caught myself, and I said, "This is part of my protection. Like, I need to be the provider in this relationship. That's
mm,
one of the ways that I protect against the vulnerability of true companionship, the ebb and flow of it. And she's trying to provide for me, and I need to be grateful for her in this moment." So he was in that moment mindful enough and aware enough of his protections. It doesn't mean they're not there. It just means he chose not to act from them, and instead he practiced gratitude for her thoughtfulness and care. And to me, community is built on moment after moment after moment like that.
yeah. Do you think that one of the reasons in the church people might have a hard time with companionship and building these kind of relationships is because pastors seem to have a difficult time with companionship and friendship and things like that?
I have such a heart for pastors. I work with a lot of them in my role
Mhm.
as a therapist. And you know, what I hear from pastors most consistently is, I so badly want to be able to be honest with my congregation, but I don't think they'd be okay with that.
Mm,
Um, and so companionship is built on this mutual give and take of honesty and authenticity, and like, and basically saying, I'm sort of messy as a human being, and I'm going to take responsibility for my messiness, and try to grow. And pastors don't really usually feel like they have the degrees of freedom to do that. um, it's sort of like they have to hold the neatness for the whole congregation in a way. And so I think that exacerbates their sense of isolation, and their sense of loneliness, and it deprives them of the opportunity to practice and model the kinds of companionship that the congregation could then really build upon and carry on. So I think it's I think you know, I think we need in the church a really great conversation about giving our pastors the freedom to be messy people, and to show up with that messiness, and be a companion essentially to the congregation, so that the whole community can follow that lead.
yeah. I've known so many people in ministry, and if I'm honest, I struggle with this too.
Yeah.
That you try to open yourself up to people in the church, and hey, I want to walk with you in this, and then something happens,
Hmm.
and that you feel stabbed in the back. They walk away, and a lot of times the temptation is just to keep people at an arm's length from here on.
Sure.
I'm not going to
Ab-
let that happen to me again. I have to
Absolutely.
build this shell, and how do you prevent that when that happens? I mean, it
Yeah.
even happened to Jesus.
Well, that's right.
You
That's
know,
right.
so when that happens, how do you prevent that?
Well, I mean, you're what you're describing is that it points out the sort of the bravery of being a pastor, is that you're really putting yourself in a position to recapitulate that early childhood wound,
Mm,
of showing up to the world the way you are, and having somebody say, "Nope, I don't
right.
like it.
Yeah,
You're not getting my. I'm actually going to vote with my feet and leave."
yeah,
Yeah, because you were who you are, and it's done publicly a lot of times, and so the level of vulnerability for a pastor to being hurt is really, really high. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, to appreciate that about our pastors, that every day they're putting themselves in a position to sort of have to go through the hardest human experience, which is rejection and abandonment. Um, and then at the level of the pastor, it's, you know, it's the burden of every leader,
Yeah.
to not resort to protection when those sorts of things happen, but to keep showing up honestly, and trust that the people who remain will be the ones who value that kind of presence, that kind of companionship, and that kind of community, and then you can build your community around that core of people.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that you talk about in the book, you mentioned it a moment ago, is the relationship that shame has to the false self.
Mm,
And in the book, you actually, you know, it's real quick, but you use the example of how a lot of times we can begin to pick up shame in
mhm.
church, you know, from
Yeah, yeah.
pastors and that sort of thing. How can we talk about something like sin
Mm,
without and it not just lead to shame in
mm.
those who hear it, so that their, you know, response is not to go deeper into that false self? Is there a way to do that?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think it has to do with making sure that sin isn't the first conversation you're having in community. It oftentimes is,
that's good. Yeah.
right? But like, if your sin conversation is flowing from a conversation about who are you beneath your sin or beyond your sin, who did God create, when God made you, and this understanding that, that God loves us because that's what He sees. He loves us in spite of the sin because we're more than our sin. That grace has eyes for your worthiness and for your beauty, and for the image of God within you. And as long as we know that, then we can have a conversation about just honestly real. I remember, I remember going to my first therapy and just telling my therapist something terrible I'd done, and he said, "Yeah, of course you did," you know, and and or like I remember him asking me one day, "Do you think you're arrogant, Kelly?" And I said, I think I do. I think I am arrogant." He goes, "I think you are too, about as much as the rest of us." Um, and there was just that space
Yeah.
to be broken and to be sinful, and to say, and yet there's a foundation of worthiness that God sees, that grace sees underneath that. And then all of a sudden, we're freed up to feel, and this is a really important distinction, to feel guilty about our sin instead of ashamed of it.
That's
And there's a huge difference, right? And this idea that guilt is about doing something wrong, and shame is about being something wrong. And guilt tends to motivate us. It tends to, when it's in its purest form, actually motivates us to fix things, redeem things, apologize, forgive, and those sorts of things. But shame tends to make us want to hide. I mean, if I am something wrong and I can't do anything about that, I better just hide it away and protect it.
Hmm.
So if we can have that first conversation, then we can have a sin conversation, and we can feel guilty, which is awesome. Feeling guilty is amazing. Like, it tells you what you get to go do to make up for what's been done, and to make the world a better place, and to improve your relationships. And divorce from shame, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah. So it's all about where that conversation comes up.
I
Both.
think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. If you jump right in on the sin conversation, there's no safe space
Mm.
to relate to it in a way that's healthy.
Yeah. What role does social media play in all of this? I mean, you talk about it in the book. I'm trying to remember the hashtag that you use, not
Yeah,
FOMO. Is
yeah.
that how you say it?
Fonmo, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And what role does social media have in, in all of this, keeping us from
Mm.
these real relationships and that sort of thing?
Yeah, the way I like to think of social media, and really any form of digital, I'd include text messaging. I think Apple includes text messages in social media, so
Mhm.
I can too. But like any sort of digital connection, is that it gets us through droughts of analog connection, but it can't replace them. And when we
Yeah.
start to let it replace analog connection, there's actually data around this. I came across it in Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism, I think. And the idea is that studies are showing you can engage in as much digital connection as you want, as long as you're also getting healthy, normal levels of analog connection. It's when the digital connection starts to take over your time, energy, and resources and push out the analog connection that it starts to lead to more depression, more anxiety, more relationship dysfunction. So, a concrete example of that would be, we're sitting at the dinner table with my 17-year-old and he pulls out his phone, right? And he starts to look at it. Well, all of a sudden, the digital connection is now reducing or interfering with his moment of analog connection. So
Mhm.
that's probably not going to be good for him in the long run. But if he's connecting in an analog way with his friends and family in healthy ways and in adequate amounts, then he can fill up some of his extra space with digital connection. That's fine. So particularly this year, it's been clear we need digital connection to get us through the droughts and analog connection, but we need to make sure that they don't replace them. And I think more than ever, we are aware we don't want them to replace them. We need that analog face-to-face, personal connection in our lives.
Yeah. Well, Kelly, I want to honor your time, and it's been
Yeah,
great
thank
talking
you.
to you. But I want to ask one more question. Just the last question. So just the idea of true companions uh, looks really hard in a divided world.
Mm, mhm.
And so, what would you say to people listening, watching? What would you say is a step that we could take towards people to
Mm,
build these kind of relationships?
yeah. Um, Boy, that's a great question. Let's talk politics. All right.
Let's
No,
go.
yeah, right. Let's go. Let's alienate half of the people who are
That's
listening
right.
right now. Um, I go back to that idea that where there is division, there's protection.
Mm,
And I don't think culture changes from the top down. People at the
mm,
top have too much. I mean, they got there, so they like how the culture got them there. They have investment in staying there, and so like I don't think culture changes kind of in the White House. I think it changes in your house. I think everybody in their own homes, in their own relationships, moment to moment, taking responsibility for the ways that they're protecting themselves and unnecessarily creating distance in their relationships and creating divides between people and people groups. That's how culture changes. When enough of us say, I'm fed up, this division isn't getting us anywhere good. I'm tired of feeding my ego and how it thrives on feeling separate and superior. I want to feel connected and close to even you who has different beliefs than me. To me, that's how it'll change. And that's why one of the reasons I'm so excited about True Companions is that I think it gives people a sort of a framework for understanding how they can start doing it today in every relationship and in every moment.
yeah. Well, Kelly, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the
Yeah,
time to talk, man. Um,
great. Thanks, man.
hey, so our listeners, people watching, how can they get in touch with you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, I have a website, drkellyflanagan.com. It's drkellyflanagan.com. And if people want to stay connected, in the top right of that homepage, there's a button that says "Get Your Guide." And what it is they'll sign up for my email list, and they're going to get a 52-week guide for walking through the three essentials of a truly satisfying life: worthiness, belonging, and purpose. Basically, every week we'll have a reading that's sort of an inspirational reading related to a topic in each of those areas, and then a practice that they can practice every week for 52 weeks. So that's a good way to stay connected to the community, is just go to that website and get your guide, and then you'll get my monthly email that comes out every month. But then also, I mean, if they're interested in True Companions, they can go to truecompanionsbook.com. It's truecompanionsbook.com, and find a place to pick it up. It's available wherever books are sold.
Yeah. And you're on Twitter too, right?
Yeah. The Twitter. I guess my three big ones are Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So you can
Okay.
find me at each place at drkellyflanagan.com. You can find me in any of those spots.
All right. And we'll have
Yeah.
we'll have all of those links in the show notes.
Thank you.
Hey,
Appreciate it.
hey, thanks a lot. It's been great to talk to you today.
Thanks, Mark. Likewise.